Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. This is our third research roundtable, and today we're featuring Professor Angela Addae, who is going to talk about her research with the University of Oregon School of Law. Her project is entitled Saving Black Portland, Reimagining Urban Development as a Tool for Black Empowerment. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to hearing about your research.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Angela Addae. I am an assistant professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, and I am very appreciative for the funding support for this project, Saving Black Portland, Reimagining Urban Redevelopment as a Tool for Black Economic Empowerment. So this is a project that is really exciting and has really been interesting to take on. I've worked with two research assistants on this project, Ariel Jackson and Molly O'Brien, and we have been focusing on Black-owned businesses and more broadly, community organizations in Black neighborhoods. And this work is especially important because Black buying power is tremendous, but Black consumers are often excluded from broader conversations about economic development and urban redevelopment. And so too, not only are Black consumers excluded, but the businesses that serve the needs of Black consumers are often left out of those conversations. So the needs of Black consumers tend to be ignored or dismissed. And the goal of this project is to highlight not only the relevance of Black consumers, but also the businesses that serve them and the historical and contemporary narratives of those relationships. This project in particular focuses on Portland, Oregon, the historically Black neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland. And the goal of our project is really to just understand the social, the political, and the organizational infrastructure of those neighborhoods in North and Northeast Portland, historically called the Albina district in Portland. So this portion of the project that I'll be discussing today required a really rigorous systematic analysis of primary sources, primarily newspapers, print newspapers, and also some digital media. So I am extremely grateful for my research assistants who spent an entire summer sorting through microfilm, which is quite remarkable. We searched through 1,560 issues of the Portland Observer, which is a newspaper, an African-American newspaper in Portland. And we covered issues from 1990 to year 2020. We also embarked on some social media review as well, searching through social media posts from about 2016 to 2020 as well. And these were all newspaper articles or social media posts related to gentrification and organizational landscapes. So I mentioned a large portion of the project relied on primary print newspapers, which we were able to access through the night library via microfilm, but that was also one of the challenges of our methodology, that our data and our data collecting practices required our physical presence in the library. So we were constrained to library hours and library openings, et cetera. Whereas some other portions of the project are more accessible digitally. So we were able to identify multiple themes in the project, and the themes are quite varied. So I've selected two to share with you today, and I hope that you'll find them as interesting as we have. So to start off, I mentioned that the plight of Black-owned businesses is often excluded from conversations about urban redevelopment because many Black-owned businesses serve consumers that are already marginalized. So really the conversations and exclusion of Black-owned businesses really perpetuate the existing racialized paradigms that exclude Black consumers. So nonetheless, Black businesses are important, especially in Oregon, where Black consumers are less than 5% of the state's population. And so you have a fraction of the state's businesses, or these Black-owned businesses are a fraction of the state economy, but they do a lot of the work in serving the state's Black consumers. So Black businesses are important primarily because they provide culturally relevant goods and services for diverse consumer groups. Many Black businesses are inspired by the richness of Black culture itself. So they focus on industries and goods and services that cater to Black consumers, like clothing stores, like hair care, like restaurants, and et cetera. So these businesses are really designed to bring access to services and goods to this specific community's needs. And these types of ventures uplift communities, they foster a sense of pride, and they advocate for the people that live there. So they really serve as a bridge between Black consumers and more mainstream consumers. Black-owned businesses also work to reduce the racial wealth gap. We can trace the origins of today's racial wealth gap to Jim Crow era policies related to redlining or job discrimination, racially restrictive covenants, et cetera. And all of these mechanisms work to segregate Black Americans or Black Oregonians even from higher paying jobs, from home ownership opportunities, other phenomena that ultimately prevented wealth building. And then additionally, Black-owned businesses work to strengthen local economies. When Black businesses flourish, so do their communities. But oftentimes, as is indicated by the racial wealth gap, probably a product even of some of those discriminatory policies from the Jim Crow era, banks often hinder Black prosperity through lending discrimination, et cetera. So we have a lot of Black businesses that struggle to gain capital, struggle to have access to business loans and those type of things. So Black-owned businesses work to strengthen local economies in just their operation. And then lastly, Black-owned businesses foster job creation. First, as I mentioned, many Black-owned businesses fund their own ventures because of the lack of access to capital, but also those that are not sole proprietorships, they oftentimes are more likely to hire from the local community. So as I mentioned, we've identified a number of themes for this project, and this project focuses on the interaction between the organizations in Black neighborhoods and the phenomena of redevelopment, urban redevelopment. Some may also refer to that as gentrification. So what is the experience of Black organizations in redeveloping neighborhoods? How does that alter or shape the relationship between Black consumers? What types of gaps are left in their absence when organizations are unable to continue operating in Black neighborhoods, when organizations are displaced because of redevelopment efforts, additional properties, state sanctioned development, et cetera. So there are lots of different themes here, and I hope to highlight two for you today. And that is the story of nightclubs and grocery stores. You might be wondering what on earth could nightclubs and grocery stores have in common? But these two very different organizations or types of organizations are quite critical for Black communities in historically Black neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods that we looked at in North and Northeast Portland. Again, they're very different types of organizations, but they serve really important needs, whether that be related to sustenance and health, or to entertainment and social life and community building. So what we found is that both of these types of organizations are essentially caught in the crossfires of urban redevelopment in North and Northeast Portland. And we think that it tells a bigger story about the relationship between Black consumers and the businesses that serve them. And ultimately, perhaps most importantly, the state that serves them. So for Black consumers, this relationship can be edifying, it can be uplifting, or it can be destructive, or it can even be predatory in some instances. And as I mentioned earlier, in sort of the Jim Crow era, I think most of us may be familiar with, let's say, the role of lenders or the role of realtors or banks in sort of the ultimate destruction of the Black community. But I hope this project highlights for you some of the roles of other institutions and other commercial entities in either contributing to sort of the uplifting of Black communities or even the deterioration of Black communities. So I'll start with two or three types of grocery stores, Safeway, E&M Century, and Trader Joe's. And I hope that these three entities can be representative of the types of relationships that Black consumers are forced to navigate. And so what we'll see through these examples is the transition of a relationship from one that is edifying and uplifting and community building to one that can either be isolating or community dismantling or divisive or fracturing. And sometimes that transition from community building to fracturing is even facilitated by the state. So we'll see some examples here. And what I've done for visuals for you all is I've included some clips from the microfilm articles. So some of them may not be as great of a quality as we'd like, but bear with us. This is what myself and my research assistants had to sift through. So hopefully you can at least be part of our microfilm experience. All right, so here's an example of a market that has a quite tumultuous relationship with the consumers in this particular neighborhood. And this is an article from January 31st, 1990. And it shows, it discusses this relationship or this tension between the patrons of Quick Mart and the employees of Quick Mart. So they talk a little bit about how the neighbors and the shop owners and the residents, other shop owners and also community residents have been mishandled, they've been insulted by store employees. And this article is one of many, but it represents what can often be an abusive relationship between Black consumers and the organizations that serve their communities, especially organizations that are owned or operated by non-Black entrepreneurs. So Black consumers oftentimes are forced to, by just simply being in a neighborhood and being forced to patronize certain establishments, they're forced to face abuse or discrimination. This can also extend to increased surveillance, heightened policing, for example. One example, even in modern times, in Walmart, I heard Bradley mention Walmart earlier, it's not unusual for Black hair care products to be locked in enclosures where you have to have a store employee come and unlock the hair product section, for example. And then similarly, in beauty supply stores, there's often very visible cameras and monitoring systems, creating this surveillance context in Black communities and organizations that Black customers are forced to patronize. And if you recall, even in more recent times, the story of George Floyd. George Floyd was killed by a police officer, but that interaction with the police officer was one that occurred after a store clerk summoned the police for the alleged use of a counterfeit $20 bill. So again, oftentimes Black consumers can have tumultuous relationships with the types of organizations that serve their communities. So that's one example. Here's another example. I think is kind of interesting and creative. This is an ad for Safeway, where they utilize culturally relevant images, cartoon images of two Black individuals. It seems like a mother and a child. I'll make that assumption. With the title, Safeway is in your neighborhood to stay. So again, this more culturally representative, affirming message that creates a more of a communal relationship between the targeted audience. And this is again from the Portland Observer. This is 1990, so a little bit throwback, but it shows that these culturally specific visual representations, it tries to forge a positive relationship with the Black consumers. And this can extend to hiring Black workers, making sure that there's culturally specific products. And this is from an organization that is not necessarily Black owned. So this is still a community organization, an organization that is serving Black consumers, and doing so in a way that tries to forge a positive community connection. Safeway, there are also several other articles where Safeway is involved in community programming, supporting community events, funding community projects, etc. That being said, there are also allegations that sometimes large commercial chains in Black neighborhoods can provide inferior products, can provide inferior meats and produce and things like that. I saw one comment that said there's a heightened presence of these imperfect produce companies. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with these sort of food delivery imperfect produce, where they take produce that are bruised or whatever, or abnormal in some way, and sell them in a box. Well, I saw one comment that thought that was a funny concept because that was the norm. That imperfect produce was the norm in grocery stores in Black neighborhoods. So again, sort of a mixed bag here with Safeway. On one hand, very positive attempts to create a community inclusive, welcoming environment for the store, promoting ads in the Black newspaper, providing culturally specific visual representations, etc. But on the other hand, there might be slights as it relates to the quality of the goods served in that neighborhood, or the attention to the stores in that neighborhood. This is another example of the Safeway ad. Again, you see those characters, cartoon characters as well, and then you also see a short ad on the side, or a short article on the side, that announces two programs. These two programs were related to the selling of bus passes, transit passes in Safeway, as well as Western Union money transfers. And I'll speak to the transit bus passes. Again, having this community presence that supports and facilitates things like access to transit and all of that is definitely a community building component of a neighborhood organization like Safeway. So again, doing its best to serve the needs of the community. So this is a second type of grocery store. This grocery store is called E&M Century. And this article in particular is highlighting the new location of the grocery store, I think it's a second or third location of the grocery store. But the article talks a bit about how the grocery store first opened in 1967. They maintained the same phone number for the entire time since 1967, that the owners of the grocery store had given out birthday balloons to 3 generations at that point. And so really focusing on community building. They talk about how employees of the grocery store could qualify for a bonus program that would enable them to purchase stock in the grocery store. So again, we see this edifying relationship between the grocery store and the community, even so much as so as serving that racial wealth gap function, closing the racial wealth gap function. And similar to Safeway's ad, we see this local Black-owned grocery store posting an ad in the newspaper celebrating and acknowledging Juneteenth. And Juneteenth recently, I think it was last year, that became a state or federal holiday. But this is in 1992 that this grocery store is posting an ad celebrating Juneteenth, acknowledging it as a culturally relevant holiday for its consumers. And again, maybe even promoting some of its products that might be used for something like a Juneteenth barbecue or Juneteenth family gathering. So again, recognizing the culturally specific needs and practices of its consumer base and targeting as such. So while this I mean, if there's going to be this type of targeted advertising, it might as well be done in a way that is culturally sensitive to the needs of the population being served. So I highlight this because it shows that there are culturally specific needs and there are culturally specific resources necessary for community building, necessary for inclusion of Black consumers. But mainstream organizations might overlook that if they are not keen to these culturally specific needs. And then lastly, I include the example of Trader Joe's as one that served as a fracturing of the Black community, or fracturing relationship between, let's say, the state or the city of Portland and the Black community. And this is in the instance where there was a resistance to the introduction of a Trader Joe's in Northeast Portland. This Trader Joe's project faced a lot of resistance. I believe it was supposed to be located on Northeast Alberta and MLK, Martin Luther King Boulevard, and the community banded together to resist the placement of this Trader Joe's. Eventually, there were other organizations, another grocery store that replaced this project, but it shows not only the community resistance and activism necessary and the agency of the community in resisting this grocery store, but also sort of the distance between community needs and the state, and the state's acknowledgement of those community needs. So this is the article that shows that they ultimately declined to institute the building project for Trader Joe's. So if grocery stores are tell a very visual and upfront story of gentrification, I think that nightclubs do the opposite. I think that the grocery stores, their narrative and the history of the evolution of the grocery stores in North and Northeast Portland is sort of very explicit, whereas the story and narrative of the nightclubs and the deterioration of the nightclubs tell more of a hidden story, an underlying story of gentrification in the North and Northeast Portland. So in the 1990s, North and Northeast Portland was plagued by some of the same issues as other large urban areas. There was drinking, there was gambling, there was gang violence, there was drug trafficking, and a lot of that oftentimes spilled into the streets. And so city agencies worked really hard to shut down what they considered to be disreputable establishments by utilizing different levers of city governance, namely liquor licensing. So the story of nightclubs and their relationship with gentrification or the urban redevelopment of these neighborhoods is one where we see the enforcement of liquor codes, the enforcement of noise ordinances, as well as any criminal laws or criminal violations of these different establishments. And this approach of utilizing city levers, utilizing land use levers, ordinances, licensing, et cetera, really laid the foundation for strategies that were ultimately utilized as well when it came time to redevelop the neighborhoods. So now we see in the same neighborhoods on the same blocks where establishments were shut down because of liquor licensing rescinding, or because their liquor licenses were rescinded. We see new entities and new bars and new restaurants repurposing those old spaces and turning into trendy wine shops or other types of eateries with liquor licenses. So ultimately, the way to look at it is the liquor is still there, but now the Black consumers are gone. So I have a few examples of that trajectory as well. So this is as early as 1993. that we were able to find a liquor licensing dispute with Gabby's, which is a nightclub. And as I mentioned, a lot of these nightclubs or lounges even may have had issues with violence when you combine alcohol with potential community tensions with gang violence, et cetera. There were instances of violence. But here, what I want to point to in this image is the support at the city commission meeting, the OLCC hearing. You had over 100 supporters come out and advocate for the renewal of this liquor license withdrawal for this establishment. And even within this hearing, the establishment alleged that there was prejudice. They alleged that there was arbitrary treatment, and that ultimately resulted in the revocation of their liquor license. Similar scenario, and I'll quickly go through these examples, but same thing. And this is so the first example was in 1993, and we see the same practices showing up in 2002 with Formosa Cafes struggle with their liquor licensing dispute, and it's never made easy. We're talking about minority business owners having to navigate very complicated bureaucratic processes or administrative processes to fight for the livelihood of their businesses. And oftentimes they are disempowered. Oftentimes they're subject to the authority of the state without any type of representation or access to the different protocols, et cetera. So this is we're talking about the bread and butter of their business. Here's another example from 1999. This social club, the Cleo Lillian Social Club, had been in the community for over 40 years. And this is a time in which the community had already started to transition. So I like to think of the sort of shift in urban renewal and urban redevelopment of this neighborhood as being around 2000, but some places even earlier in 1999, 1998. And this is around that time, 1999, where the neighborhood was starting to shift. The neighbors to these businesses were starting to shift, and therefore you had increased noise complaints against this club. And as you can see from the headline, a historic albino landmark is how it's described that's being threatened. And again, this organization had been in the community for over 40 years. And then that same issue discusses the last day of Cleo's. So really, it's not just a sentimental loss. It's certainly it's a cultural loss for this community. This was one of Portland's last remaining Black-owned bars with a landmark location on North Vancouver Avenue. And if you know anything about Northeast Portland and North Portland and the North Vancouver Williams corridor, you know that area has very much so experienced revitalization. And here we're seeing the very beginnings of that process where the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, or the OLCC, rescinded this license for the social club, ultimately resulting in a closure. Same thing, 2011. Same story, Club 915 again loses its liquor license, primarily because of violent incidents of violence, but also I think it raises a larger conversation about balancing the need for public safety as well as the need for safe third places or third spaces, which are spaces that people can gather and be amongst their cultural communities. Okay, and last example, LV12s, 22s, same situation. And this is in 2012. So I provide these examples to show that a lot of these liquor licensing disputes are just one of many phenomena that laid the groundwork for the evolution of this Black community vis-a-vis the Black-owned businesses, and how it laid the groundwork for urban redevelopment. So what does this mean for Oregon's consumers, and more specifically Oregon's Black consumers? I think that the liquor license disputes reveal a lot of elements related to symbolic economies, or opposing symbolic economies. A lot of these organizations and new bars are marketed towards people who live outside of the neighborhood, and this is to the exclusion of Black consumers. So while it may not be explicit, a lot of things about the new establishments can make them feel unwelcome. They can make them feel excluded, and it can create resentment among, let's say, working class consumers, where they broadly resent the changes brought forth by gentrification. You'll see words and terms like "we" or "everyone," and those terms are used somewhat as proxies for middle class consumers, proxies for establishments that are trendy, that are desired, and it skips over and ignores, and perhaps even invalidates ethnic character, and kind of valorizes gentrification. So that being said, I think we need to pay more attention to not only the kind of larger, bigger solutions, and I always appreciate Tom's questions about remedies. What do we do? So I think it's important to think about, think beyond sort of the big picture, let's say minority business programs and things like that, and pay attention to the administrative hurdles and obstacles that can plague Black establishments, Black-owned establishments, Black serving establishments, and ultimately work to the detriment of Black consumers. This project also takes a look at the closure and unavailability of these spaces, and what resources the consumers are tapping into, how the emergence of virtual spaces is kind of filling in the gap for these brick and mortar spaces. We can also think a lot about land use practices, land use resources or tools like special use districts that preserve the character of these neighborhoods and preserve the establishments there for these specific consumers. There are other jurisdictions that are looking at things like commercial rent control. In New York, for example, they toyed around with the idea of commercial rent control. And then the state of Oregon has also taken some initiatives with things like targeted relief funding through the Oregon Cares Act, or support through business incubators through Business Oregon, et cetera. So there are lots of different resources available, but I think that the goal is to recognize that the needs of Black consumers are legitimate, recognize that these culturally specific services and goods are necessary, especially for the livelihood of Oregon's very small Black consumer population.